Might help if I turn the microphone on.
Yeah, didn't know what was going on there. I was waiting for you to talk.
Good evening, Melbourne. Happy Easter Sunday, the day of the Lord's resurrection. And it's good to be with you. Those of you who are joining us live, make sure you drop something in the com box to say hello. Let us know who you are, because you're just numbers to us at the moment, and numbers mean nothing. We want names and faces and interaction. But otherwise, if you're listening on podcast during the week, it's the Easter octave. So every day of the octave is as if Easter Sunday. So happy Easter to you. How are you going, Brendan?
I'm going well, Father. Happy Easter to you.
It's a good day. It's been different, but it's good.
It is a very good day. I have been waiting for this day for
90
a
days.
good while. 90 days. I'm done, Father. Exodus 90 is complete. I got a little message this morning from Exodus 90 saying congratulations, and I said thank you.
And you made it through. So it's Easter Sunday. It's the greatest day on our church's calendar, which means that we can rejoice. So after your 90 days of abstaining, what have you chosen to rejoice with? What is your drink of choice this evening?
You got to do it. You got to enjoy a beverage on Easter Sunday after Exodus 90, especially after Lent. If anyone's watching, please make sure you've got something to drink. If it's a glass of water, I won't judge. But tonight, Father, I'm drinking a little bit of a gin and tonic.
A very classy choice. What type of gin did you choose?
It's a good question, Father. What kind of gin? Gordon's, the original.
Oh, there we go.
Gin, Father.
Right, very good choice.
It's straight from a can, actually. I don't know what.
Okay, so you went from classy to trashy in a very, very quick moment there, Brendan. But it's Easter Sunday, so good on you.
That's it. What are you drinking, Father? Maybe?
I am actually. I put it out on Facebook, and there was a few suggestions, but I'm just having a nice little whiskey at the end of a busy day. So it's good to be with you as we celebrate Easter Sunday. This is our third podcast. We're not new at this anymore, but we're also not good at it anymore. We're making it up as we go along. But for those of you who may be listening or watching for the first time, Brendan and I decided to do this as a way of just keeping the young Catholics in Melbourne in particular connected, especially during this time of social isolation and separation because of COVID-19. So it's pretty freewheeling. We make it up as we go along most of the time. But we will start this evening just by praying together the prayer of St. Joseph that our Archbishop wrote himself, I believe, for this time and for the church here in Melbourne. St. Joseph, you were receptive to God working in your life. Help us by your prayers at this time of trial. You kept Jesus and Mary under your watchful care. May your prayers assist our local church to respond to those in need. You taught the Christ child your trade and prayers. Help us to follow his example of love. You are part of God's plan for all humanity. Assist us to be vigilant and responsible this day. You spent your life in service. May we be mindful of others, particularly the elderly and vulnerable, caring for them in these difficult days. You trusted in the clear primacy of God over all history and every situation. Help us to grow in faith and to pray to the Father, thy will be done. Amen.
Amen.
St. Joseph,
pray for us.
Pray for us. So, Brendan, what did you do for Easter? Was it a different Easter for most?
Yeah, it would have been. But fortunately, again, I was blessed to go to Mass to sing for a live stream. At Gladstone Park.
Oh yes.
Which I was very, very thankful for, and it was beautiful. It was beautiful.
Wonderful. Well, I obviously celebrated the Triduum here in my parish. It was different to any of the others that I've celebrated, either as a priest or attended as a seminarian. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was definitely an absence without the people of God praying with you. I think any priest that you speak to would agree with me on this, but there is a real sense when you have a church full of people who are praying and actively supporting the priest in his responsibility of offering the Mass, that there's a real tangible difference. So when you're celebrating Mass, and we as priests celebrate Mass on our own quite regularly, private Masses on our day off or holidays, perhaps on retreat, but when you're in your own church and you know that people should be there, and they're not there, you do feel that absence a little bit. And I think for me, the liturgy that spoke most to that was last evening, the Easter Vigil, because it's different to, I suppose, any of the other Masses that we celebrate, but in particular the lighting of the candles and the looking out from the sanctuary during the series of readings from the Old Testament and just seeing an empty church, where normally you have this beautiful sight of just these little flickering flames of faith that have been lit from the Easter candle. So that's probably the time that I felt it the most this weekend. What did you do today?
Well, after Mass, I celebrated with the family. We had a nice big lunch. It was a bit late, but it came and it was incredible. I certainly ate my food, and Lent was over, not just in my heart, but it was over in my belly as well. I was full and it was good.
Bit of a food coma this afternoon?
Oh, I've been so sleepy. I couldn't believe, I just had to really wake myself up before getting on here, Father. But how did you go? Did you experience the same thing?
Same thing. It was lovely to have a bit of a celebratory lunch and then a bit of a nap this afternoon, and then try and get a bit excited about our podcast and everything that we're going to be talking about this evening. I did catch up with some of my parish staff this morning, and they did share with me a couple of interesting stories, which I might share with you as we go on throughout the evening. But I suppose the challenge for us all now is that Lent is over, and we're in this season of Eastertide. But in addition to that, we're still in this time of social isolation and sort of not being able to live our normal lives. So it almost feels like Lent isn't over, which in and of itself is a bit of a challenge. And there was this great image in the Australian during the week of Jesus coming out of the tomb, and then there being a police car sitting out the front saying, "Don't even think about it." And it feels a little bit like that. It feels a little bit like, okay, we're an Easter people and we're coming out of the tomb, but we haven't really gone anywhere yet, and we're not allowed to go anywhere. So that even Jesus himself sort of has risen, but he can't go very far. So we've got to find ways, I suppose, as Catholics to really try and live this season of Eastertide, it's a wonderful time in our church, and it's normally marked in the church itself by extra candles and flowers and more music and more solemnity, and a series of these great feasts that always follow on from Easter that for the time being we're not going to be able to celebrate together as a community, at least. So how do we keep that season of Eastertide alive in our hearts? And that's one of the challenges. Have you got any thoughts as to what you can do, Brendan, in your own?
Yeah, yes, I have been. Father, you know this. When am I going to get my cello is my big question.
Has it not arrived yet?
Finally, it has not arrived yet. No, it hasn't. It's in isolation as well, apparently. But I should be getting it in a week. So that's what I'm going to be learning. I'm going to be learning the cello. That's going to be joy for me and for my whole family.
Yeah, I don't know about that, mate. I really don't. One of my parish staff did let me know that there was someone in the last week who, a little bit like you in the cello, so this might be a word of warning about whether or not you really want to be trying some new things, but was an astrophysicist who decided that they were going to try and develop a cure for coronavirus. Have you seen? Did you see this in the news?
No, I have not.
He decided that he was going to create a necklace made out of magnets that would set an alarm off every time he went to touch his face.
Oh, that's clever.
Because that's how we spread the virus. Which was all very good, but it didn't work.
I can't see anything going wrong with that, Father.
Well, but of course, as soon as we start on something new and it doesn't work, what do? We just decide to just throw in the towel. So he himself reports that unfortunately it didn't work. So he just started to have a bit of a laugh and mindlessly placed the magnets on his face. First on his earlobes, then on his nostrils, just like a magnetic piercing. Great news. Really good. The problem was when he put the second magnet on the nose, it got stuck up his nose and he couldn't get it out. This guy's an astrophysicist.
What hope do we have?
So of all the tools he had at home to then try and get them out, of course, he had a pair of pliers, which are made out of metal.
Oh, metal. Oh, please. It just gets worse.
So the guy who was trying to stop people go to hospital ended up getting people to hospital. So an interesting take on things to do in isolation. So just be careful with that cello. If you don't succeed at first, sort of just keep trying and just be careful that it doesn't sort of turn into something particularly bad. Right. Okay.
What are you going to do, Father? What are you going to do to keep yourself occupied and happy and busy during this Easter season of isolation?
I'm going to do a little bit of exercise. I've decided it's time to get back into training. Brendan and I first met on the Camino de Santiago, walking the Camino de Santiago, which was a wonderful way to keep fit and to get fit. But there's no Camino this year, so I'm going to try and up my exercise a little bit. I've also decided that it's time to teach some of the young people in my parish who live nearby how to cook, because I'm a little bit worried about the lack of cooking skill amongst some young Catholics and the young adults in my parish, but also that here in this time of isolation that it's a time to sort of take something new up. So I'm going to teach a few of them how to cook. So that's one of the lessons that I'm going to do. You got a nice haircut there, Brendan. I didn't think hairdressers were open at the moment.
Well, whether or not they aren't, or are not, or are, I don't know. I've got no idea if they're open, Father.
Right.
But so the question.
So how then did you get a haircut?
How have I maintained it in such a great way, Father? I've been learning some new skills as well. One of those is acting. I've purchased myself my own set of razors and clippers, and this is the result. What do you think?
Well, I'm not one to really talk about hair, so I better be careful.
Father, don't worry. You got a bit of you get haircuts too, surely, or do you cut your own?
No. I struggle with the back, so that's what I'm a bit interested to know, sort of how the back of your hair is going.
That's why I'm thankful for this time of isolation, because no one can see the back of my head, and I'm not about to spin around right now and show you. It's a little bit too high, and I don't think it's straight, but it's all right. During this time, it doesn't matter anyway.
It doesn't.
But if you want any lessons, Father, you let me know, and I'll be happy to give you some hair cutting lessons.
Great. It is the season of Eastertide, though, and in our church, it's always been a time where we've given ourselves over to growing in faith, or a term that we use is mystagogia, which in particular is referring to those new Catholics who come into the faith at Easter, but it can be a time for each one of us in these days between now and the Feast of Pentecost to really focus on a growth in our own faith. So I think that that's something that we can all be trying to do in this time, in addition to the cello and the haircuts and the physical activity and the cooking lessons. I think, well, if you're anything like me, and I've only been back for a couple of weeks, but I've pretty much worked through anything decent on Netflix, and I'm going a bit stir crazy with all the time on my hands sometimes. So I think maybe if you're feeling that way at the moment, really using this time of Eastertide as an opportunity to grow in your faith. I said in my homily to my parishioners this weekend that the resurrection of Christ demands of each one of us a response. And sometimes the temptation is that our response is to go to Mass. So I suppose at this point of our lives, when we can't get to Mass, we're actually challenged to ask ourselves that question, well, what's my response? If my response up until this point has been going to Mass, and I'm faithful to Mass, and I might even go to Mass during the week, and that's my response to the resurrection of Christ and the great mystery of Easter, then what do I do now? So how do we find ways to respond to the great message of Easter and the fact that Jesus Christ died for us? And I think using this time to really enter more deeply into an intellectual understanding of our faith is one thing that we could be doing to really respond more positively to the gospel. Have you, Brendan, got any experience in your own life about growing intellectually?
When I went to school, I went to a Protestant school, so I was constantly surrounded by Christians who weren't Catholic, so they were always kind of curious of what I believed. So that kind of forced me or gave me the motivation to learn about my faith. That challenged me intellectually, and that gave me, I suppose, a bit of an outlet to have these discussions and to be challenged. But I think it was because I just gave it the time, and because I gave it the time, I uncovered just the richness of the Catholic faith. I couldn't believe how much content there actually is out there, how many conversion stories there are. That's been my experience.
I think one of the things is that, especially if we're at uni or at work or at school, and we're faced with times where we have to explain our faith or people are questioning us, then we have to dig a bit deeper and we have to find answers to those questions. But a challenge of this time of social isolation is that we're maybe not being prompted as much as what we were. Perhaps maybe a little bit on social media, but otherwise we might be living at home with people who agree with us. We might be catching up regularly with friends who agree with us, but that drive to deepen our faith because we need to be able to explain it to others can be a little bit sort of lessened. So how do we find opportunities in our week to really delve into our faith and the various elements of truth? So there's a couple of really great tools out at the moment that I just want to draw some people's attention to. The first is from the St. Paul's Center, which is out of America, and it's Scott Hahn's Institute out of Steubenville University. And I had a great pleasure earlier in the year of being at a conference run by Scott Hahn and hearing him speak live, and just a really, really knowledgeable biblical scholar, himself a convert from Lutheranism, but he's now a Catholic biblical scholar, and he's written a great series of works, and anything you can find from Scott Hahn is worth reading. Have you read some of it, Brendan?
No, I haven't, but
Yeah.
I've had a couple of conversations with some friends and some people who have.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So if you haven't, it's really worth sort of seeking out some of his stuff. But through the St. Paul's Center out of Steubenville, he's got a variety of different resources on offer, in particular during this time of the coronavirus, but in particular at the moment, and I don't know how long it's going to last for, so now might be the opportunity is his series on the Eucharist, which is a book and a series of videos that you normally have to pay to participate in. He's actually offering free of charge to anyone who wants to do it online. So if you just go to the website, stpaulcentre.com/free-stream. It's up on the screen now if you're watching the live stream. But it's a wonderful resource, and it really helps delve into the depths of the scriptural basis for our understanding of the Eucharist. And in particular in this time when we're separated from the reception of Holy Communion, we're separated from the Eucharist, reading and participating in a study like this might be a really solid way of ensuring that we're growing in our faith in this area. So that's one option. The other one is this great online Catholic conference that was run recently, and it was a live conference, but all of their resources now are available online. Now, you do have to pay for this one, but it was a bit like sort of every Catholic, decent Catholic, solid Catholic speaker in the world getting together and putting an online conference together. And it's a really wonderful opportunity, again, if you're looking to I suppose over a period of time, because to troll through the hours of content that they have there, it's going to take you a little while. So that's probably a really good one to do if you want to sort of delve into it over a bit of time and invest in some formation at the moment. So I suppose growing in our Christian faith is a really important part of this Easter season. One of the beautiful things last night at the Easter Vigil, of course, is how we go through this series of Old Testament readings. And if you haven't been to an Easter Vigil before, or it's been a little while, we read through a series of 7 readings from the Old Testament that help us see how God's been at play throughout all of human history. And it's a reminder that even in the good times and the bad times, that God has been present to the world, and that his hand has been moving throughout history, guiding the salvation of people, which obviously reached its fulfillment in the coming of Jesus Christ. And it, I think, was a reminder to me last night of how sometimes we forget that God is moving throughout history. Sometimes we step away and we get a little bit absorbed and we start to panic that God's around. And I think we've seen recent history in the church. Sometimes we can be fearful that God has stepped away. And I suppose in the last week in particular, we've seen an example of this in the case of Cardinal Pell and what's been happening. So I'm sure many of you have been watching it throughout media, social media, reading the papers, keeping up with the case. But obviously the High Court acquittal that came through on Tuesday. Brendan, how aware had you been of the Cardinal case and everything that had been going on for the last couple of years?
I was aware. Like, I knew that it was happening. I wasn't fully. I certainly wouldn't say I was fully into the details or kept up to it too much. But I was certainly praying, especially during the Victorian court appeal and through the county court, whatever the initial court case was. I was aware of it then, but certainly not in the details.
Yeah. And obviously we knew that the High Court was deliberating, and we'd seen earlier in the year the couple of days of the High Court case, and we were given the advice that it was coming out on Tuesday. So, and it was definitely all over the media, especially I think sometimes the media was pleased to have a bit of a break from reporting only on COVID-19. But it was obviously a momentous day in the life of the church in Australia and in the life of many Catholics, because after what has been a 4-year battle, finally the truth comes out, and this man who many of us look up to and many of us admire for his role as a leader in the church was exonerated and was set free. I think before we delve into it, Brendan, I think it's important, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, that nobody denies that as a church, we've done the wrong thing for many years, and that bishops and leaders have turned their back on victims and those people who have suffered at the hands of priests. As a young Catholic, how do you feel about this whole area of sexual abuse? What is within your church and the church that you're a member of?
Part of it was also part of it because I've converted to the Catholic faith. Like I chose to come into the Catholic Church. It's saddening and it's sickening, really. I mean, because the priests and the religious, they're the ones we look up to. They're the ones that are called to live a holy life, are called to be the ones that we look up to and the ones that we follow. So it's hearing about it in any form at any time under any circumstances. It's just like just a great sadness and a great anger towards the whole situation. Like why is it that God's holy church, God's people who have been set apart to praise him, to bring him glory and to lead his people, how any of them could do something that's just so opposed to what it is to live the life directed towards God. The hypocrisy, it almost encapsulates everything everything negative that you ever hear about the church. And it's hard being a Catholic, feeling like to some extent having to bear the weight of that sin. But at the same time, it's just reminding us of the how human the church is as well, and how human and broken all of us are.
Yeah. I think the thing that upsets me most is obviously the travesty that priests in particular, but brothers, some religious women and lay people who in positions of trust have abused minors and done the wrong thing. It's vile, and it is never acceptable. But I think the thing that upsets me even more is that throughout history there's been bishops and leaders who have then covered that up, who have then done even worse acts by moving these priests around to different places and protecting them. And while there may be some little glimmer of an excuse that we didn't understand then what we do now about this, it was never acceptable, and it was never not sinful, and it was never not a crime, which means that bishops and leaders of the church never had an excuse not to act thoroughly and to hand these perpetrators over to the police. So it's a really terrible mark on our church, and the response of the church over many years has been equally as terrible. But on the flip side of that, I think we as a church have learned a lot of lessons from the past. And we have started to respond more compassionately. We have definitely, in the last 20 years, responded more thoroughly in the screening and selection of candidates. And I can tell you this from my own personal experience, because not only did I have to go through it to get into the seminary and throughout my entire time at the seminary before I got ordained, but now I'm involved in the work of vocations. I know the kinds of screening and testing and psychological evaluations that guys have to go through before they even get a look in at the seminary, let alone before they get into a seminary and then onto formation and priesthood. So things are dramatically different now in the life of the church, not only in Melbourne, but around Australia and around the world. But here in particular, and this is one of the saddest things of the case against Cardinal Pell, is that he was the man who implemented those changes here in Melbourne. He was the man who reformed the seminary to ensure that these things would never happen again. And he was one of the first, if not the first bishop in the entire Western world So long before Boston, which is seen as the real explosion onto the public scene of sexual abuse in the church, so long before Spotlight and Boston, Cardinal Powell had already started implementing changes here to the Melbourne Seminary and to our response to victims. Yet, because of his role as the leader of the church here in Melbourne and as the figurehead of the church in Australia, even after he left Australia, he's been a lightning rod for victims. And as a result of that, this wasn't the first time that he was accused of crimes that he didn't commit. There's been a number of other accusations that have been rallied against him over many years that have all been disproven time and time again. And we saw this week that this final one was thrown out, and it was thrown out emphatically by the court. I think that should give us all a sense of consolation. But the other thing that is really consoling is the sense of peace that there seems to be in the Cardinal at the moment. Last week we spoke about saints that we would like to spend isolation with, and I mentioned St. Paul because he always seemed to find joy in his imprisonment. Well, there's only one other example I've seen of that recently, and that's Cardinal Powell. I know that I'm not holy enough yet to have been falsely accused, been through a trial, imprisoned for 405 days, and then to come out and to say something like, I don't want to add any more hurt or bitterness. There's hurt and bitterness enough in the world. And I'm like, whoa. And I sometimes, even my own sort of response during the week was like, we've got to fight this and whatever. But he's just walked out of that court, out of that prison, and he said, this is it. I didn't do it. I said I didn't do it. And I don't want to add any more hurt and bitterness to the world. And I'm like, and where was the first place he went? A monastery.
Oh, in Kew, the
Yeah.
Carmelite Monastery.
With St. Therese. So
Oh, of course.
it was, it's been a really challenging week. Did you see much of it? You weren't on social media, so how did you see it all transpire?
Yeah, so I wasn't on Facebook, but I was on, I think, just the WhatsApp groups that I was a part of. It was like 10:05 when the news came out.
Yeah.
Pretty much just the fact that he was free, that he was finally free of all of these charges, which I think that for many of us we knew were quite unbelievable and quite incredulous, like just too difficult to believe that it was true. And for so many people who knew him personally, and from people who knew the cathedral, knew the situation.
I think that's one of the points, isn't it? Because so much of the trial was under embargo, a lot of the detail of the accusations was never really released to the public. And unless you've actually spent some time reading it or going into the depths of the case, sometimes we only see sort of the top of it. But the accusations that went to court and that were tried, and that the county court, that the High Court in the end said it's not possible. It is not possible for a jury to find beyond reasonable doubt that these happened at St. Patrick's Cathedral on a Sunday immediately following Sunday Mass. And you've been at the cathedral, you've been into those sacristies. I've been there many times. But any church, any sacristy after Sunday Mass, there's copious amounts of people all the time in and out of these spaces. And I suppose that's what they found in the end, was that it was a physical impossibility for these crimes to have been committed as they were accused. And that the jury erred. And we believe that this is the role of our High Court system. And I think one of the greatest things for me is not the vindication that this man has been proven innocent, but that he entrusted himself to the Australian legal system. That he was in the Vatican. He was a diplomat. He had immunity. Yet he freely gave up an apartment, and I've been there. I've seen he had it wasn't a palace, but it was a nice apartment near St. Peter's Basilica. He never had to come back, and he gave that up, and he gave up his position. He stepped aside, and he flew back to Australia of his own free will to face these charges and to have them tested by the legal system. And in the end, he's been vindicated for that decision. He knew of his innocence, and he trusted the legal system. Now, it was a bit of a wavy route, but we got there in the end.
And I think just seeing the way that even just the way that you describe it, how he submitted himself to our legal system, I just think how much of a Christ-like figure he's been throughout this. Like when you think of Christ, how he allowed himself to come before Pontius Pilate, how he allowed people to falsely accuse him. People accused Christ of blasphemy, and I think the modern day equivalent of that, I think, has to be child sexual abuse. Like what a more shocking way for your reputation to be damaged in that way. I couldn't think of anything more harmful towards me that could be done or could be said. It's just something that's just so horrific. And I think that Christ experienced something very much like that when blasphemy was accused against him. And then for Cardinal Pell to be in prison for 405 days for a crime that he didn't commit, that all of the evidence is stacked up against it, the people who know his character, it's incredible. And then to hear his response afterwards, I think that there's so much for us to learn from Cardinal Pell during this time, how he's responded to his suffering, how he's responded to being falsely accused of, to be so gracious in his response. And if anyone here hasn't heard his, I think he wrote something in the Weekend Australia, and then he put a statement out the same day. An incredible man. And it makes me think, Father, of Christ once he had died on the cross, and when on his resurrection day, when he was resurrected, his initial response wasn't to go get the Pharisees who took him away. He wasn't to get back at the people who killed him. His initial response was to go and visit the people to see his disciples. It was to build up the church. That was his intention once he was resurrected. And I think that Cardinal Pell's response right now, he hasn't got a spirit of vengeance. I think he's really got a spirit of being a light during this time of great darkness, of isolation. And I think he's a man that we need at this time.
And like the great irony, of course, is that he's released from 405 days of solitary confinement to go into solitary confinement. But again, I think if you're looking for an example to help encourage you through this time of sort of social distancing and isolation, especially if you are sort of a student and you're struggling to find time to be committed to your study and to attend to those things that you've got to be doing, I think he's a really great example. We know that he received upwards of 50 letters a day whilst he's in prison. He chose, I've heard, not to respond to any of those yet, but he only responded to those prisoners who wrote to him. So he really saw himself, even in his isolation, he still saw himself as a priest, and that he had a priestly responsibility to minister to those who he was confined in, even if it was just via letters. So even I think there's a great encouragement for us in our own times that we're confined, where we don't have a choice about where we can go and what we can do, but we still have opportunities to minister and to reach out and to serve those who are in confinement with us. And we have the opportunity to console others and to be a peaceful presence in their life when they're also struggling. And that's just what I imagine what he did. And he mentioned in one of the interviews that as he watched the announcement on the television, because he was in his cell, and that a cheer went up around the prison, and he doesn't know exactly where from, but then he said that those in his immediate vicinity made it very clear, and they're the words he said, that they made it very clear that they were happy for him. And I'm imagining that was in ways that he couldn't sort of necessarily report in the paper. But I suppose when our confinement is up, when our isolation is over, will those people cheer? Those people that we've been confined with, will they cheer with joy because they're leaving confinement with us? Or will they cheer with joy because if Brendan keeps learning the cello, his family will probably cheer with joy? But will they cheer with joy because we've been a sense and the presence of Christ in their life? And I think your point's really, really valid, Brendan. Then when we do get out, are we just going to go crazy? Or like him, are we going to actually be Christ-like in the world? And I think that's one of the things that I keep hearing. And it's interesting how you start to hear these things through secular media and other sources throughout this time, when people are sort of saying, at the end of this, are we going to go back to what life was like beforehand? Are we going to go back to being busy and overworked and stretched too thin and doing 101 other things? Or what are we going to learn from this experience? So there's lots to happen, and it's Eastertide, so it's a wonderful time to be doing it. It's interesting, and if you haven't read some of the stuff on Cardinal Pell, there's some really good stuff out there, and I think one of the most articulate voices I've heard throughout the entire trial is that of Father Frank Brennan, the Jesuit priest who himself is I'm pretty sure a constitutional lawyer, but otherwise he is a civil lawyer, a very highly qualified civil lawyer. I think he's currently the president or the principal at Newman College here in Melbourne. He himself says quite publicly not a supporter of George Pell on many matters when it comes to theology and the church. But as a man of the law and an Australian citizen, he followed the case very closely as a way of being interested. And I think this is the really important thing for all of us, is that this, I don't remember much from year 12 legal studies, but one of the things I remember is how important the High Court is in making determinations because of the precedent that it sets for future cases. And the challenge of this case was whether or not there was enough evidence to convict on this matter, and if it had have been held or upheld by the High Court, then it would have been a very dangerous precedent for me and for you and for anyone going forward. So, but Brennan speaks to all of this and to some of the particular elements of the Pell case in a number of places. If you're a subscriber to the Australian newspaper, he's written a very lengthy piece in the Australian newspaper. I don't know whether it's behind a paywall or not, but have a look into that. That's Father Frank Brennan, but also on Sky News. And you can definitely see this. The day of or the day after, he did a 10-minute interview, and it's available on YouTube by Father Frank Brennan on Sky News, where he stood there and for 10 minutes just outlined the last 4 years of the case and the history, and all the salient points are really clear and articulate. So again, if you're looking for ways to speak to family or friends or other people about this, that would be a great resource to utilize. We're almost out of time, so thanks for joining us this week. We promised that we were going to be 45 minutes on the knocker this week, and we're just out of time. So It's been a full week in the life of the church, both liturgically and spiritually, but also in the broader area. So hopefully we've helped unpack a little bit for you. Please do us a favor and make sure you subscribe to the page at the bottom so that we can have a few more followers. Make sure if you're, especially if you're a student or a young person at home at the moment, or a young worker working from home, make sure you join us during the week. Father Marcus Golding and myself are praying each day the Holy Rosary at 12 o'clock and then the Divine Mercy Chaplet at 3 p.m. So a really wonderful way of punctuating the day, especially in this season of Eastertide, with prayer. And sometimes it's often a challenge to get these prayers in, especially if we're doing them on our own. So make sure you join us live here on Melbourne Praise channel. Brendan.
And thank you to everyone who's been on the comments section. Thanks to good old Jerry, Ben, how you doing? Good to see you. Matt, Tina from Gladstone Park, good on. Joe Mellum and John Florio, legends. Thanks for listening. Thanks for commenting as well.
Great.
And Father Nick, till next week.
Yeah, keep an eye out during the week for some more details on the biblical program that we spoke about last week. Also, some cooking lessons that may or may not eventuate this week that you might be interested in. But otherwise, until then, we might conclude with a prayer. As again, we're very conscious that so many people are without the reception of Holy Communion at this time. We take a moment and make an act of spiritual communion. My Jesus, I believe that you are most present in the most holy sacrament. I love you above all things, and I desire to receive you into my soul. Since I cannot at this moment receive you sacramentally, come at least spiritually into my heart. I embrace you as if you were already there, and I unite myself wholly to you. Never permit me to be separated from you. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks everyone for joining us this week and for listening online. Make sure you share us with your friends, and we'll catch up with you soon. God bless.
God bless. Thanks, Father.